moving on, let's move on to the immune system. Your immune system is there to defend you against exposures to microbes, foreign things, and things like that. It's your body's defense system. So we have two parts of our defense system: innate, which is just built-in general response, and then acquired. Acquired immunity is where those antibodies, like we talked about with the ELISA test, that's where that stuff comes in. Acquired immunity is very specific to a specific antigen. Innate immunity is saying, this is not self, get rid of it. That's all. It just knows that it's not self. It's a very general response. And so we have two sides of innate immunity, the first line and the second line of defense. The first line is things like your skin. You have a keratinized layer of skin cells on the surface of your skin that just prevents microbes from getting into your skin. You get a second degree or third degree burn, that keratinized layer is compromised, and now microbes can get in. So that's providing a barrier. So we have physical barriers like that. We have the acid in your stomach that gets rid of a lot of the microbes that you're getting on your food and exposure to your environment there. We have the mucus that traps microbes. Things like this are all your physical barriers that are involved in that stuff. And that's also going to be including chemical barriers, like the fact that your stomach has acid in it, or the fact that your saliva produces an enzyme called lysozyme. And that is something you need to know for this chapter. And there's a slide for it. We'll get to it. But this is an enzyme that literally breaks down peptidoglycan. That's what that enzyme does. Like that enzyme lysozyme literally breaks down peptidoglycan. And that's what it exists to do. And so that's in your saliva, it's in your tears and things like this to help get rid of microbes, very generally speaking. Okay. And then of course your microbiome, we have bacteria that are taking up all the possible spots that could potentially be taken up by pathogens. And that's helping out with that. So that mechanism, remember what we called that was microbial antagonism. So immunology is your body's defense system against the microbes that you could be exposed to in your environment. Constantly, your body is surveilling everything that's going on in and out of your body. Is it self? Is it non-self? Is it waste? Do I need to get rid of this? Recognizing something as foreign and being able to destroy it. We have to be able to tell the difference between self and non-self. This is a constant thing that your body is always adapting to. And if we come into contact with a new thing that could be foreign, your body has to label it and be able to label it as foreign and not as self. Your biome, your natural biome, whether it's in your gut or in like your sinuses or wherever it is going to play a part in helping your body recognize when and where things should be and at what time and how to react to it. So all that training starts off very early on from infancy. And when you're born and you're exposed to the environment, your body's getting trained as to what is self and what is non-self. These are all based on markers on the surfaces of things. And so our antigens is anything that your body could see as a marker, essentially. And these are things that our immune system can label as foreign. And so if it's labeled as foreign and we can see it as foreign, that's our antigens. Okay. If there are other markers on our cells that our body has had to be trained to say, this is not a marker for foreign, this is a marker for self. Your cells are all going to be involved in getting trained constantly from the moment that they are made by your bone marrow to be trained as to what's self and what's non-self. This is why if I give you my kidney, you could reject it because your body sees that as non-self. We'll get into that in chapter 17 into the logistics with that. All right, so we have to know self versus non-self, and this is not a perfect process, and this is where autoimmunity comes into play. So if we have strep bacteria in your throat, they have a molecule on their surface, hyaluronic acid. And in case you haven't been paying attention, hyaluronic acid is a very, very common biological molecule that's important in like basically water maintenance and things like this. And so if we come in and recognize strep as foreign because it has things like peptidoglycan on it, and we say this is definitely a foreign thing, and we start sending signals, attack the foreign thing. Sometimes the signals get mixed up and say, okay, strep is foreign. It has this molecule hyaluronic acid on it, and this is a foreign thing. So let's attack hyaluronic acid as foreign. If you don't have something in place to tell your body, no, don't attack that. We have that too. So if you don't have mechanisms in place to remind your body that self is self, and that we don't attack these certain molecules because those can be associated with self, that's when we start getting into autoimmune disorders. It's when your body starts seeing self as non-self, because we got signals associated with other things telling us that. A lot of our autoimmune disorders are actually tied in with They should have been seen as self, or they may have been marked as self. And then you get exposed to a microbe that shifts your body's response to that thing. And now it's no longer seen as self. It's now seen as, now more importantly, we should be seeing this as foreign. So you start attacking molecules that are in your joints, and the joints become inflamed. And then as a response to the damage caused by the inflammation, you have buildup of bone and tissue and swelling, and you lose function in those areas as a result of that long-term inflammation. We're going to get into how autoimmune disorders function and the damage that they can cause and things like that in chapter 17 as well. Chapter 17 goes over all the ways that your immune system can go wrong. That includes allergies, that includes reasons for ROGAM, all sorts of stuff like that. All right, in your innate immune system, one of the biggest ways that we can actually associate something as being a bad guy is through PAMPs. And you better believe this acronym is going to be on your Unit 3 exam. So what does PAMP mean? It's pathogen associated molecular pattern. So a very good example of something that your body can automatically associate with a pathogen is lipopolysaccharide, LPS, also known as endotoxin. All gram-negatives have it. Is that a specific marker to a specific pathogen? No. What other pathogen has a COVID spike protein? Only COVID has a COVID spike protein, and your antibody will recognize COVID spike protein. That antibody doesn't also just recognize all spike proteins. It's very specific to a specific thing. But a PAMP, all gram-negative bacteria have endotoxin, and that's a shitload of bacteria. We're talking about large, like heavy identifiers as, if I see this molecule, it must mean bad guy. So endotoxin is one of those. Another one is peptidoglycan, an obvious one. Your cells don't have peptidoglycan. It's an easy marker for your body to say, this is not a self cell if it has peptidoglycan. So peptidoglycan, endotoxin, which is the marker on the outer membrane of gram-negatives, as well as double-stranded RNA. Even in our tRNA, it's one single strand of RNA folded back on itself. Anytime you see two strands of RNA kind of bound together the way that our double-stranded DNA does, that's a viral genome. That's the only time your cells are going to see that. And so that's another marker. So those are three markers that can serve as PAMPs that just trigger your innate immune response to immediately say, not self, this is foreign, attack it. We don't need to be specifically told, this is specifically the flu virus, marker, and then we need to attack it because it has this flu virus marker. The fact that we can see that it has these general patterns means foreign. There's special receptors called pattern recognition receptors that interact with them. All right, your lymph system. Your lymphatic system is not part of your circulatory system. It's a complete separate other system. So your lymphatic system refers to all of the vessels and the lymph nodes and the lymphatic associated tissues that have function in this system in order to filter out things. So what happens whenever you cut yourself with a paper cut? You're doing your taxes, you're getting all your W-2s together, and you cut your finger. Why does it turn red? Why does it swell up? Why does it ooze fluid? Why all these things? We know why it bleeds, because you actually cause damage to the blood vessels and now the blood can leak out. But where does everything else come from and why? So that's dealing with your entire innate immune response. What's going on is when you have an injury, you have damaged cells. Those cells are sending out signals saying there's been damage. We need to respond and start healing this, right? We need to put into gear healing and figuring out what we need to do to keep infection from happening and all of that. So the damaged cells immediately just automatically release help me signals. And the help me signals cause blood to flow to that area, increased blood flow to that area, and the blood flows to that area and releases fluid into the tissue. So it gets out of your blood vessels and moves into the tissue. And this is what causes the tissue to swell. It's why even whenever you are stub your toe, there might not be broken skin, but you probably have some sort of tissue damage there. So the blood flows to that area. The fluid portion of your blood will come out of your blood. And with that fluid portion, proteins to help those cells like get nutrients that they need for healing, signal molecules to call for your inflammatory process to start, as well as the white blood cells and things like that to come clean up any damage and get rid of any foreign stuff. all of that stuff is coming out of your bloodstream. So that stuff's coming in. Let's say you got your paper cut and some bacteria just from your environment gets in there. Happens every time you get an opening in your system. And that bacteria is coming in and we're sending out signals, help me, help me. Fluid flows out of your bloodstream and into the tissues, into that area with the nutrients. Things like your white blood cells and everything are responding to that. They're moving out because of these signals. And so you have swelling in that area. You have redness because of the increased blood flow. Swelling is from the fluid moving into the tissues. The redness is from the increased blood flow. The warmth, also from the increased blood flow, right? And so you have all these aspects of inflammatory process. And there's four major aspects of that that we have Latin words for that we're going to get to later on in the chapter, which deals with the redness, the swelling, and the warmth, and all these things, and pain that's associated with the injury response. And so those are all signs of inflammation. And that's starting off the process of moving the cells and the signals and everything that comes with them that are involved in healing and cleaning up that whole area. All right. So the fluid that flows into that area, we've now got white blood cells eating up foreign things. We've got signals sent to other cells to help with healing process and all of this stuff. So that fluid doesn't just stay there forever. So we would say, in our general understanding of things, okay, you hurt yourself, it swells up. Where does that fluid go after that? We'd say, well, it's reabsorbed back into the body. And you're absolutely right. But how and where? What happens is it moves back into the lymphatic system. So that fluid does not go back into your bloodstream. Why doesn't it just go back into your bloodstream and just go back to recirculating? Because there could be microbes and toxins and things like that. And your immune system needs to filter that back out before it rejoins your bloodstream, because your bloodstream is sterile. But in your blood, does your blood carry around nutrients and cells that are involved in bringing nutrients and things like that to the rest of your cells? That's what your blood does, right? We're talking about your blood is an open stadium. No microbes are taking up those seats. And it's a massive stadium with millions of seats, all this opportunity for microbes to take advantage of these open seats. And there's nothing sitting in those seats. So you start introducing microbes from your paper cut into your bloodstream, those things are going to grow out of control if we don't check it. So what happens is you get your paper cut, fluid flows into that area, including your white blood cells that are coming there to eat up the bad guys. And some of those guys, the white blood cells that have the bad guys, and just the bad guys in the area itself, will get drained back into your lymphatic system. These are special vessels that basically take fluid that came out of your bloodstream and moved into these tissues in response to any injury at all. And that fluid will come back into your lymphatic system and get filtered before it rejoins your bloodstream. Your lymphatic system is a series of blood vessels, your lymph nodes, and associated lymphoid tissue that works very similarly to your lymph nodes. That's all going to just filter out all of that crap that comes from your injured areas and filter it before it rejoins your bloodstream as fluid back in your blood. That stuff, that flow of the fluid from your extremity where you got your injury and back into the heart, that space in between in your lymphatic system, is not pumped by your blood. Your blood pumps your blood, but the blood doesn't pump the fluid into your tissues. The blood doesn't pull the fluid back out of your tissues. So what actually is driving your lymph getting to be forced back into your bloodstream? Does anybody know how your blood and your lymph come back to mix together? What forces your lymph to rejoin your blood? You know what your body does to get that to happen? It's not your heart pumping. Yes, so what is actually forcing? So if you get an injury in your toe right now, you stub your toe and you break open your skin and you're exposed to the dirt and the microbes there. Fluid flows to that area. That fluid needs to get filtered before it rejoins the blood through your lymphatic system. So what's forcing, if I'm standing here right now, it would start happening. What's forcing the fluid in my swollen toe back up to the heart? Your muscles. So what is the number one thing that you tell your patients after they have surgery or something like that? What's the number one thing you need them to do? Get the F up and walk. Why? Because the only thing that gets your body filtering your lymph is skeletal muscle movement, not smooth muscle, not your heart, none of that. You have to move your lymph with muscle movement, your skeletal muscles. And I can't drive that home enough. So when your patients have surgery and they can't get up, what do we do for them? If you know, then you know that we typically will put these things on their legs, the largest muscles in your body, and it'll squeeze those muscles to try to squeeze back and forth, right? And so we're telling you like, oh, well, that's to prevent edema. What is edema? It's the fluid buildup in the tissues, right? Why did the fluid build up there? Because you rely on your muscles to constantly move the fluid that moved out of your blood vessels and into your tissues. You rely on your muscles to help move that out and filter through your lymphatic system to rejoin your blood. Is this starting to make a little more sense how that's going to work? Okay, so let's move on to this. We talked about lymph. It's the fluid of it. It has all the proteins and the signaling molecules in it. And it also is what carries all the nutrients for our white blood cells that are carried within the lymph. The vessels, they're going to carry the fluid from your extremities back in towards the heart. And in that process, we're going to filter it. It's like a checkpoint going into a different country. If you're moving out from my toe all the way back to my heart through the lymphatic system, then what you're going to have to do is move through every single checkpoint on the way there. And I'm telling you guys, there's thousands and thousands of lymph nodes throughout the body. There's not just lymph nodes here and in your arms and your groin. They're all over. And so you're going through this checkpoint after checkpoint after checkpoint after checkpoint. At each checkpoint in your lymph nodes, you're going to have to verify that you belong there. If you don't pass the sniff test, they're going to start the immune response against you. They're going to eat you up and destroy you. If you don't have every single, it's like, you guys ever heard of these games like Papers, Please, or something like that? Like there's these games that basically like you can play online as video games, and you have to check that everybody has all their paperwork in order, that the right numbers match the right numbers, and nobody has expired paperwork, that like you have all the things in order, that they're on the list to pass through. That's what your lymph nodes are doing every time that fluid flows through them. We are checking that everything that flows through that lymph node has all their paperwork in order. Everything. So that's all going to be forced through by your skeletal muscle movements. And that's why when you have an injury, it's so important to get moving to help this whole process work. And the lymphatic system runs pretty analogous and alongside of your circulatory system, but it operates separately. And so it'll feed all that fluid that we lost to our tissues back into the circulatory system. But then what's going to happen if you get another injury? The fluid's just going to flow back out again to that area. So we have to constantly be circulating this stuff. And even just like if you go, like me, I injured my back, right? So there's an inflammatory response already going on in that area. So fluid's flowing out in that area. If I just sit on my butt and don't move around, then you're going to have swelling. And that's going to just cause more inability to function, because of now the swelling in the area causing that compartment to be, not able to function properly. So getting up and moving around is incredibly important for helping this whole process move along. These are your lymphatic organs, your red bone marrow, number 1. Every single blood cell in your whole body, white or red or platelet, whatever it is, any cell in your blood that functions in your blood and your lymph is going to come from your red bone marrow. So there's these stem cells in your red bone. So you know what a stem cell is? It's like a precursor cell that can turn into a lot of different other cells. So stem cells in your red bone marrow, called hematopoietic stem cells, can become any number of blood cells, depending on what signals they get from your body. And so that's why bone marrow is so precious when we're talking about somebody that has lymphoma or leukemia. Let's say a patient has leukemia. We can treat them with radiation, and that radiation will kill all of their immune cells and all of the cells that are in their bone marrow, including their stem cells, because their cancer is coming from that. So we can kill all those cells with radiation, take your bone marrow, just a little bit of it, and your stem cells from your bone marrow will populate as stem cells, and then their body can say, I need more red cells, I need more platelets, I need more white cells, and send the appropriate signals to them to differentiate them, and then train those cells on what's self and what's non-self. And all that's going to happen from those precursor cells called hematopoietic cells in your bone marrow. So this all starts with your bone marrow. There's another organ that's right here in your chest called a thymus. And this is going to shrink ever since you're born. Pretty much from day one when you're born, it's going to start shrinking. Usually in adulthood, it's like almost not there at all. So this is where your T cells, which are T lymphocytes, are going to be maturing. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter. Then we have our secondary lymphatic organs. And these guys are usually have some sort of other aspect of function that they're doing, like your lymph nodes. This is just a place where a lot of that filtering is going to be going on. So there's cells that are going to take up house in that in the lymph nodes, and they're going to do their function there. But it's like the station where you're going from one country to another, where you have your checkpoint. The lymph node is the building. Does the building actually do anything? No, the people in the building do the things. So your white blood cells that are in the lymph nodes are doing the work. The lymph node is just a station where that happens. Okay. Your spleen. Your spleen has the exact same function as your lymph node, but your spleen filters your blood. And it's the only organ that you have that actively filters your blood and not your lymph. So the spleen does not filter your lymph. The spleen filters your blood. The biggest function of your spleen is to filter out damaged red blood cells, old red blood cells, and get rid of them. But one of the other things that it does is also filter just your blood, just like your lymph nodes do. It's a site where your white blood cells can hang out and check out the blood, not the lymph. So if you missed something that got through the lymph, or if you had an infection that got introduced into the blood that just bypassed the lymphatic system, that's where your spleen is going to do the checking. We could still catch it potentially if the spleen doesn't catch it. The spleen has function. You don't just not need your spleen. So spleen does that as well as get rid of your red blood cells. Does anybody here have a splenectomy? So it's not uncommon to remove a spleen from an organism or from an animal, right? You can have an injured spleen, and because it's so important for filtering the blood in general, you can lose a lot of blood if you have a damaged spleen very easily. So we'll just remove it, and you can survive without it, but your body will have to compensate for that loss somehow. So we'll have to find different ways to get rid of those damaged red blood cells, and you can actually have people who lose their spleen that can have problems with getting rid of their red blood cells. And if you're somebody that has something like sickle cell disease, where you have blood cells that don't operate properly, that can put a lot of stress on the spleen, just in general. And so they might need a splenectomy just because their blood cells aren't right. And so that's what your spleen does. All right, moving on. This is not anatomy class. I don't know enough about it beyond that, but those are my basic understandings of the spleen. All right, salt, malt, and galt. ALT part of this. So they all share the ALT. ALT means associated lymphoid tissue. This is tissue that's not a lymph node, but it has a high concentration of white blood cells there, like lymphocytes, like your B cells, which we'll talk about their function in the next chapter. But this is an area that has a similar function to the lymph nodes, but they're just in a different form. So these are associated lymphoid tissue. They function like your lymph nodes, they're just not in lymph node form. Does anybody here know how big a lymph node is? Approximately, anybody want to guess how big a lymph node is? How big do you guys think it is? You think about a walnut, maybe? Right, so we think maybe it's smaller. So a lymph node, if you take a pea, like a green pea, cut it in half, that's the average size of a lymph node. When it's not, right, when it's not responding to infection, right? And so some of our lymph nodes get a little more action pretty constantly all the time, like the ones in your neck. They're constantly being exposed to microbes from your environment, from breathing in and out and eating things. And so those guys will be a little bit larger because there's a lot more action going on in those guys. But in generally speaking, having been somebody that worked in a transplant lab and actually doing all of the testing for transplant patients, I'm going to tell you, if you are an organ donor and we prescribe you as brain dead, I'm not going to have the argument as what are the ethics of that is. But if medicine decides that you're brain dead and we can use your organs, what they'll do is harvest lymph nodes from that donor in addition to the organs. And they'll send the lymph nodes priority express to that lab. So if there's a brain dead donor in Texas and they get matched with somebody here in Oklahoma, we're either going to have to fly the donor or their organs that they removed in Texas from that area to Oklahoma in like within an hour or two of harvesting it, right? So it's like an emergency sort of thing. And with that organ comes that patient's lymph nodes. And we will usually get anywhere from 3 to 10 lymph nodes from an organ donor, usually closer to 3. And some of those lymph nodes are pretty crappy. And so we have to like flush out all the white cells from the lymph node and then harvest all those white cells and then match that person's white cells to your recipient's cells and make sure they're not attacking each other. because if they start attacking each other, then they're going to attack it in the body too. So that's what the gist of the watered down version of what that side of the lab does. So we can do all the pre-testing for that and hope that it's not going to do that. But then we're going to take the actual cells from the donor and the actual cells from the patient and literally match them up within hours of that surgery. Right before we're going to do that test. And then that test is going to say, you may proceed with the surgery. While that patient is waiting there in their gown, getting ready for the surgery, they're waiting on me to make sure that there's no attack going on. And then once I give the go ahead, they may proceed with the surgery. And so this is really like one of those, literally the most stressful job I've ever had in my life. And I don't ever want to go back to it because that was too much for me. So anyways, we'll take the lymph nodes and they're very, very tiny. And I'm just telling you. And if I can see somebody's lymph node is a different color. So they're usually like off-white, like a beige color. It doesn't matter what ethnicity you are. That's just the color of the lymph node. But if you're a smoker, they'll be black. So I should say something. If you look at my lymph nodes, they're probably black. I'm not even going to try to argue out of it and say that I'm doing something good for my body because I know I'm not. But that's a separate argument. So anyways, lymph tissue. Lymph nodes are actually really, really small. And when you start activating a lymph response, when you start activating your B cells and your T cells to get the acquired immunity that we'll talk about in the next chapter, that's when the lymph nodes will swell up. Those cells, you have one cell in your body, just one cell, one B cell, one single cell that recognizes the spike protein of COVID. One cell that recognizes the spike protein of COVID. And when you have that, you inject your patient with that vaccine and they start making spike protein and that cell comes into contact with that one cell, once it sees it, will multiply and divide and make millions of that copy of that one cell. That's what's happening in your lymph node. That's why it gets so big, because we have to make so many copies of that cell, and then they can start producing antibody and cranking that out. And we'll talk about what antibody does in the next chapter. So that's why your lymph nodes get big. Okay? Because that you're activating one cell and then you're multiplying it into an army. All right. So think about all this in terms of like the military. We can think of it as this. We're at war with another nation. And let's say your body is your nation and everything foreign is the other nation or potential other, or we're at world war. There's all these other nations out there and it's you against the world. And it really is kind of what your immune system does, right? It's you against the world. And so you have to know what is self. You have to be able to recognize what's self in the war so you don't kill your own guys. And sometimes you make mistakes with that. And if they got in the field and they're starting to look like the bad guy because they had to pick up someone else's jacket while they were out there, it's easy to make the mistake. We have to have all sorts of things in place to check for that. And let's say, well, let's get into this first. We already talked about the red bone marrow. We talked about the thymus, and we're going to get more detail on the thymus in the next chapter when we talk about T cells. Our lymph nodes are scattered all throughout your body. You have major aggregations of them in the neck and the groin and the underarm. This is no news to you guys, I'm sure. And then it becomes enlarged because we have the multiplying of our white blood cells in response to an antigen. If you have just lymph nodes that are just swollen, like let's say in your neck, then that's a sign that you have an infection associated with like the head region, right? The neck and head region, not systemic. If you have an infection throughout your entire body, your lymph nodes will be swollen throughout your entire body. All of them will be everywhere. So that can help you decide if it's a local or a systemic infection. We did the associated lymphoid tissues. When you collect somebody's blood as a phlebotomist, we've already touched on phlebotomy and why that's important. But if you're drawing somebody's blood, the tubes that you're using are either just plain old tubes or they have something added in them. You might not be able to tell there's something in there, but I'm going to tell you. Red top tubes don't have any additives in them. They might have wax. Wax isn't part of the thing. All right, so green top, pink top, blue top, all of those colorful tops other than red. Red to me, blood, and what's just going to be in it? Blood. There's nothing else in it. But it's a tiger top tube, red and black. It just means red, blood, there's nothing else in it. The black just tells you there's going to be wax in it. So that whenever you separate the clot from the liquid, it just separates in the middle of that. So you can get a better distinction. All right, and this all matters for the lab and not as much for you guys if you're going into nursing, but still it helps to understand why there's the different colors of tubes. And each color stands for something added in the tube that helps with certain aspects of preventing the clotting. Depending on what you're testing in your patient, there might be certain things that will affect the test, or you need to prevent this from happening or something, whatever. Like green top tubes, they have like sodium heparin in them to prevent clotting. And blue top tubes have citrate in them to prevent clotting. And those are going to be used to do certain tests on the blood as well. So if you just have blood by itself in a red top tube, you send it to the lab. What the lab's going to do is take that tube and put it in a rack and let it sit there for 30 minutes. They have to, part of the procedure. And what are we waiting for? When you send me a fresh red top tube, there's blood in there. What are we waiting for when we let it sit there? If you let it sit there for 30 minutes and then you take that tube and turn it upside down, all that blood will have gone completely solid. Blood coagulates and solidifies just by itself, completely and entirely, if you don't add something to it to prevent it, within 30 minutes, easy. So when you go donate blood with OBI, they're taking it and putting it into bags that have anticoagulants in it. Because if you just put it into a bag, that bag will be a solid clot within 30 minutes. This is the clotting factors in your blood. You have to put something in the bag to prevent that from happening. Okay? And so when you take blood, let it clot just on its own and separate the clotted stuff from the liquid in that. The liquid's called serum. If you add something to it to prevent it from clotting and then take the liquid portion from that, that's called plasma. That's the only distinction. Okay? So plasma, you added something to prevent clotting. The liquid is called plasma. With serum, it's just blood. You let it coagulate, and then you separate it with the centrifuge. The solids, don't worry about it. It's red blood cells and all the clotting factors involved in it, and the liquid is called serum. That's the only difference between serum and plasma. All right. Granulocytes and agranulocytes. So we're going to know the difference between all of our white blood cells. White blood cells in general are called leukocytes. Then we have our granulocytes and our agranulocytes. And so when I take your blood and I do a smear of it, I can do a stain on your blood, and it just helps me see the parts of all the cells in your blood. And when I look at your white blood cells, so red blood cells, they're small. You know what a red blood cell is, come on. Red blood cells don't even have a nucleus. They don't. They don't even have a freaking nucleus. All that they do is serve to carry hemoglobin and transport oxygen or carbon dioxide around. That's what they do. And that's all they do. They don't do anything else. But white blood cells, they have a nucleus and they have all these functions that they have to maintain. And each white blood cell has a function. And so the two biggest distinctions between our white blood cells when you're looking at it, a stain of your white blood cells, is whether it has granules in it or not. And a granule is what it sounds like. So a granule, I guess I can just, I don't know, man. My life is the same as y'all. I just feel like I'm barely keeping it together anymore. Okay, so if you have a cell and you look at it, and it might have like these weird like circles in it that seem sort of like interconnected and whatever. I'm not even talking about that. But you'll have these like all these like little, looks grainy. It looks grainy. These are granules. And then we have cells that look like this. You have big old like single blob in here. And there's no granules. It doesn't look grainy though outside of that. No granules. It's not grainy. So our granule containing ones are literally called granulocytes. And the ones without the granules are called agranulocytes. That's really the distinctions there. And then as it turns out, the functions kind of go along with whether you have granules or not, because the granules are actually used by those cells for sending signals and controlling the inflammatory response. All right, so our granulocytes include all of the fills and our mast cells. So if it ends in fill, it's a granulocyte. And if it's a mast cell, which we'll talk about the functions of mast cells in chapter 17. I don't want to get into it now. But if it's a fill, or a mast cell, it's a granulocyte. They have these granules in there. And a lot of those granules are going to be things like histamine and things that can moderate the inflammatory response. Right, are agranulocytes. Agranulocytes fall into two categories. The first one, monocytes. Right, and the second one, lymphocytes. These are all of our leukocytes. These are white blood cells. If you're a leukocyte, you're a granulocyte or an agranulocyte. If you are a granulocyte, you are a fill or you're a mast cell. If you're an agranulocyte, you don't have granules in you, then you are a monocyte or a lymphocyte. Monocytes can then derive themselves into two different subcategories. Subcategory A would be macrophages. And subcategory B would be dendritic cells. Those are derived from monocytes. Your monocytes circulate in your bloodstream. And that's just where they are. And they can react to things in your blood. But once they start getting signals, let's say you're just floating around in the blood, you're a cop. You're just driving around on the streets, making sure everything's okay. And then you get a call in, hey, we need some help in the toe area. Person stubbed her toe again. We need some help with this. And you'll get signals in the bloodstream saying you need to go to the toe. All right. And so then it'll travel in the blood and then move out of the bloodstream and into the tissue with that fluid movement. Right? Part of the inflammatory response. Once you move out of the bloodstream and into the tissue, you're differentiating, you're changing. And that's when you become A or B. Right? Getting into a little bit more detail about that and which one's which and how that works in a minute. Your lymphocytes have subcategories as well. Your lymphocytes that we need to worry about for this class, you only need to worry about two of them. I understand there's other ones up here. The only ones you have to worry about for my class, T cells, which are our tanks. We're going to talk about that in chapter 16, and B cells, which are our bombers. And I meant to write B cells. So as it turns out with your B cells, the reason why I call them bombers, if you are a tank, you're driving into the action and you're engaging in the actual action of getting rid of these bad guys. You'll see them face on and you'll be interacting with them individually. If you're a bomber, you're not actually getting into the action. You're dropping the bombs and the bombs are doing the damage, right? And so the bombs for our bombers, our B cells, are your antibodies. The antibodies are actually the ones doing the work. The bombers are just dropping the antibodies. All right. So that's going to preface us into chapter 16 when we talk about T cell and B cell functions and our lymphocytes. That's our acquired immune response. All right, so we're going to stay in our innate response first. All right, so the way that your white blood cells move around in your body is through the mononuclear phagocyte system. It's literally just everything that's in between your cells they can use to move around. This is a network of connective tissue that allows your white blood cells to move outside of the bloodstream in between your tissues and your cells and things like that. We already talked about our monocytes, but when they move into specific tissues, they'll get specific signals to turn into certain kinds of cells. So this is either macrophage category or dendritic cell category, but you'll be like specified for that area. And then you work in that area. So once I get the signal to move into the lungs, if you have pneumonia, once I get the signal to move into the lungs, I might become an alveolar macrophage. Those are macrophages that wait out in the lungs and wait to do their action there. So we have all these different kinds of monocyte-based cells that are associated with these tissues. Cytokines are just signals that are sent by your cells to tell your cells what to do during the inflammatory response. These cytokines, these signals can be either pro-inflammatory, so they can either be triggering inflammation, anti-inflammatory, so they can be telling your body that we don't need to be inflamed anymore, or they could be vasodilators or vasoconstrictors. So we might want to increase blood flow to an area to keep things, to start sending our cells to those areas. Or we might want to vasoconstrict, so that we're not having blood come out of an area where we have an open wound, where microbes could be just getting into the blood. We don't want to be drawing them into the bloodstream. So vasoconstrictors and vasodilators, and then we have growth factor cytokines that basically regulate the growth of your white blood cells. So you might want to trigger your white blood cells to start growing if you have an infection, right? So these are all just signaling molecules that control that stuff. All right, so we already talked about the function of your skin and mucous membranes and how these can be involved in producing defense. Your nasal hairs obviously trap matter and prevent it from getting deeper into the system and things like that. We have secretions that are made in certain parts of our body that can block the microbes from getting in. We also have chemicals that can be made by your microbes or by your own cells that can control microbes from succeeding as well, including lysozyme, which is an enzyme that breaks down peptidoglycan. All right. And obviously stomach acid and things like that. So we will pick up with talking about our phagocytes, phagocytosis, and the rest of our inflammatory response whenever we get back next time. Okay. And so we'll go over this stuff. I really want to get our foundation down good with our innate response so that our acquired response makes more sense and we can understand what's going on there.